June 4th, 2000. Blazers versus Lakers. I was 8 years old during this iconic series, and when it ended, my brother and I were in tears. Kobe and Shaq breaking our Blazer hearts. We ran outside to the blacktop and promised each other that we would never let this happen when we got to the NBA. Of course, that prophecy didn't come true, but even at the age of 8, I could tell there was something different
Pure octane.
about the NBA playoffs.
Bryant. It's a shot! Bird lets it fly!
Yeah! Jordan puts the shot in the air. Good! The game's
You
over.
talk about pressure situation.
However, how much of this difference is accurate?
One possession can lose you the series.
How might we be fooling ourselves when we think about the NBA playoffs? So when it comes to the first big playoff difference, there's some simple math that gets greatly overlooked or at least greatly misunderstood. So let's not have that happen. Let's start with a quick example so we're all on the same page here. It is widely believed that there are 16-game players and 82-game players, guys who elevate in the playoffs and guys who wither when the lights shine their brightest, a character defect that has haunted the likes of DeMar DeRozan. This is a cheap narrative, one that can be easily disposed of through some straightforward math. New Orleans finished 7th in the Western Conference, so let's say after the play-in game they match up with the Nuggets in the first round. CJ McCollum is the Pels' best guard, and CJ is widely regarded as a very good NBA player. Currently, he is ranked as a top 10 shooting guard, and since he kind of plays point guard, let's also look at the fact that he's ranked in the top 15 as a point guard. One could say he is better than roughly 2/3 of the league's starting guards. At point guard, he's better than half. CJ is good. But when the playoffs begin, CJ will no longer be better than 2/3 of the shooting guards or half of the point guards. In fact, he will be below average, at least in the point guard category, as our pool shrinks to 16. Suddenly, the advantage for the Pelicans on a regular Wednesday night has disappeared because it's not Tyus Jones or Kobe White or the majority of any other regular season teams he'd be matching up with. It's Jamal Murray, a bigger, seemingly more talented guard. Even if CJ plays well, if he outplays Jamal, or if he breaks even, a far more extreme example exists just a few positions away, where Jonas Brothers Valanciunas will be matching up with, well, that guy. Jonas is an above-average NBA center, but in the playoffs is below average. And this extends to role players, guys like Herbert Jones, that are probably at a disadvantage against guys like Michael Porter Jr. It isn't that these players are lacking character. They're lacking talent, at least when the pool shrinks. And even if that wasn't your interpretation of what Draymond meant, seeking 16-game players, that sounds like a simple strategy. The problem is, you might not know who your liabilities are until it's too late. More on that later. Of course, there are many other changes beyond just the field. The game itself truly does change. Notably, the part of basketball that kind of sucks.
In pursuit, blocked by James. Flexion will get it back. Rondo takes it away.
Giving energy and effort.
The eye test, and certainly announcers, would tell us that defense improves. Players seemingly play harder.
Switch it. What an
effort.
about the hustle.
NBA even kind of made a commercial of it.
It's clearly a thing.
Defense improves.
Oh, the intensity of the playoffs.
Right? To test this, I wanted to look at the field goal percentage between regular season and playoffs to see was there a noticeable difference. And it turns out there was. For effective field goal percentage, which is the best measure here, teams were shooting 1.68% better during the regular season in comparison to the playoffs, which gives way to the thesis that, well, defense is improving in the playoffs. But one extra step here that I didn't see a lot of people take, the best defensive teams are typically in the playoffs. What if this drop in field goal percentage is just because there's better defensive teams playing each other? And, well, if there's better defensive teams, we would expect that to drop. So we controlled for this. We looked at just those teams that made the playoffs. How did they shoot during the regular season? And there was an even sharper decline. And making this more impressive, the best offensive teams are typically in the playoffs, meaning this level up in defense is even more significant. Maybe it's something else, though. Maybe it's the refs just not calling as tight of a game, letting the players play, so to speak. We looked into this as well, and turns out there are more fouls in the playoffs.
Foul by Booker. They didn't call.
When we look at the teams that make the playoffs, we see about 2 more fouls in the postseason compared to the regular season. So this theory might not hold up.
We all know playoff basketball is different. You don't get the calls.
Perhaps it's because there's playoff fouls during the playoffs, something the announcers are very quick to remind us of every single year. During the regular season, you might just let them go.
That's not a basketball play. There's no need
But
to
in
do
the
that.
playoffs, it's a different form of violence.
Oh, a hard foul.
Blood on Beverly's head.
Maybe we're just fooling ourselves with this one. But on another note, transition defense does seem to improve, and that makes sense. It's an effort-driven play. I mean, getting back on defense, that sucks. That requires a lot of energy, and you don't even know if you're going to look cool when you do it. But that's what's different about the playoffs, that noticeable change between these effort-driven plays. That's what leads to more nail-biting games, right? This was surprising. Playoff games see more blowouts than the regular season, about 3% more, and this has kind of surged in recent years. Since the 2003 season, roughly about 14% of regular season games have ended in 20-plus point margins, whereas in the playoffs, it's nearly 17.5. And there's more strangeness to this. For example, one would expect the margins to decrease as teams progressed in the playoffs. Once we remove those 1-8, 7-2 matchups, for example, we should see less blowouts, closer games. But oddly, the prevalence for blowouts actually increases in later rounds, despite the generally less competitive 1-8 and 2-7 matchups. Since 2004, 15.4% of first-round matchups have ended in blowouts compared to 17.15% of second- and third-round matchups. This isn't a recent phenomena. The difference can be seen across eras when we adjust for pace. How about that infamous Steph versus LeBron matchup from last year? Well, 3 of them were blowouts. Somehow, far more evenly matched teams are crushing each other far more frequently in the playoffs. And even more strange, this, being the rubber band effect, seemingly disappears in the playoffs. Maybe you noticed how teams play better when they're behind, and there's some truth to this. I did a more detailed analysis on another video. It is fascinating and measurably substantial, but in the playoffs, this effect nearly evaporates. Maybe teams are just less likely to let their foot off the gas when they get a big lead in the playoffs, but whatever the cause, teams are pummeling each other more frequently in the playoffs and more frequently in later rounds in the playoffs. It's almost counterintuitive in that way. Maybe all this has to do with some strategic difference. Pause for a moment and imagine that you are running an NBA team. Sounds kind of fun. In a way, there are 2 seasons you have to prepare for, an 82-game regular season followed by an extended 16-game playoff season, if you qualify. As we know, the 82-game season involves an onslaught of different opponents in different cities across the country. Many of these games will be played on back-to-back nights in various cities where you don't even have time to practice. So there will be far less time for preparation, significant adjustments in between games, and knowing these limitations, you might deploy a different specific strategy that would work against the greatest number of opponents. All of this gets into one of the more interesting and influential theories, inspired by a man's interest in poker. John Van Neumann wasn't concerned with the NBA or trying to call his opponent's hand. He actually didn't even really care that much for the card game. He wanted to apply mathematics to the world. He wanted to quantify strategy. And he did so through a monumental paper on the theory of games of strategy. A very scientific sounding title there. Couldn't just say, like, what is strategy? But I don't mean to discredit this, because this was a massively important document. It gave birth to game theory, which can be applied to any sport, can be applied to most of life in a way. Life is a series of games. And in the context of the NBA, there are at least 2 different games that we're dealing with here. There's the NBA regular season game and the NBA playoff game. and they both have different parameters. I spoke with Seth Partnow again, who's a former director of basketball research for the Milwaukee Bucks, to kind of get his thoughts on the difference between regular season and playoffs. And he shared his idea on game theory and the differences between the regular season and the playoffs. The first season we can kind of think of as a game theory optimal. Due to the travel, teams have less time for preparation and practice, and they have to deploy a more widespread strategy, a strategy that would work against the greatest number of opponents. So to add on to what Seth shared with me, it's helpful to maybe think of this as a gradient with two extremities. On one side, we have a zero-sum game. Again, the product of Mr. John Van Neumann here. On the other side, let's just say we have a win-win scenario. Those are our two extremes, and there's a gradient in between. When your team loses a game in the regular season, if it was purely zero-sum, nothing else would matter, and you would walk away with nothing. However, this is not true. You could be increasing the minutes for a youthful bench player and decreasing the minutes for a starter, and that might decrease your odds of winning that game, but it might increase the odds for future games. To put it more bluntly, why do teams intentionally try to lose? Why do they tank? For future draft picks, to try and win future games. So it's different. Unless, of course, you're Jody Allen, you just don't really care about anything. You definitely don't care about lifelong Blazers fans and the pain that you put them through. Thanks, Jody. But until the NBA changes this 82-game carousel where 2/3 of the teams get playoff participation awards, this isn't really going to change. We're going to see a lot of non-zero-sum activity during the regular season, at least for the present games. Unlike maybe the NFL, where it seems to matter a lot more each week. But in the playoffs, this changes dramatically. You have a single opponent you are preparing for. There are no back-to-backs, and you will be traveling far less. There is one goal: win now. Given this and the sheer volume of game time against a single opponent, you are given leeway to try experiments. Experiments like maybe putting your rim protector on a poor shooter so he can clog up the floor a little bit. And one of those experiments might be benching that same rim protector just a few series later for a smaller player, and that experiment might forever change the game of basketball. The strategy becomes more game theory specific, closer to zero-sum. What is the best strategy to beat a single team? Andrew Bogut made sense until he didn't. But remember how I mentioned you might not know who your 16-game player is until that moment in time? Allen was the weakness that maybe didn't meet Draymond's 16-game player standards. But Tony was an all-NBA defender, and Tony wasn't this bad at shooting, at least normally. Polling his percentages, he was over 36% over the course of his career when left this open, meaning an open three for Tony was a very good shot. And sometimes the adjustment gets all the credit for the results. What if Tony just had an off shooting night? What if somebody had pulled Tony aside and reminded him not to keep going to the short corner of the block and just standing there and clogging it up and playing like they were in the frickin' 80s or 90s? Would we have maybe had different results? Allen ended up injuring his hamstring in the second half, and the Warriors would go on to roll. People pointed at Allen as if he was no longer a 16-game player, but he very well could have been. In fact, he looked like a 16-game player when he won a championship with the Celtics just a few seasons prior. That's the problem. You won't know who that game theory specific liability is until that specific moment in time against that specific team. That is why this is so challenging. Other coaches have echoed this sentiment. The playoffs being different than the regular season is well known, but something I have wondered from afar. What's the next game theory strategy we might be unaware of at this moment? Or have we kind of plateaued after discovering that 3 is indeed worth more than 2, and there's nothing left to find? One inefficiency that I see after looking into this is 1-on-1. Isolation plays surge in the playoffs. Now, these are the best isolation players in the world, so we'd expect more isolation players because, well, the playoffs are made of players like James Harden, who's been historically good, not so great in the playoffs, but historically good in isolation settings. But still, Most teams see a big spike in isolation plays, and some teams see nearly double the isolation plays. So what's going on here? Maybe it's just because there's better defense, and although the inefficient isolation play is a poor game theory choice, it's a necessity at times, kind of like a 17-footer. But here's the thing. A lot of teams are opting for isolation plays early in the clock, and these plays also increase substantially as the game withers down. A lot of times the fourth quarter is purely ISO. Even for the best isolation players, this is an inefficient approach given the alternatives, yet ISO ball remains. Maybe in the future, we'll just kind of laugh about this isolation play in the playoffs, the same way we stare back in time and enjoy a 70s or 80s game and how there's no spacing, teams are just kind of standing around. Some other notable differences, or lack thereof, how about clutch shooting? Well, I did a whole breakdown on this, but when given enough volume, players are pretty much themselves. Nonetheless, though, there seems to be this belief that there are no more secrets to be found, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Basketball is a complex game, and because it's a complex game, a small change will compound into a disproportionate change in outcome. That's chaos theory. There are two games in the NBA, a regular season game and a playoff game. They're certainly different, and in the playoffs, teams are more creative with their changes and less forgiving. Hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and take care.